The horrifying events that happened to Paul's younger brother, who made a pact with the devil, resulted in the deaths of 4 people in the house, all under similar circumstances. This compelled Paul to find a way to put an end to this. This is Paul's story from 50 years ago. At that time, Paul was in his early 30s and worked as a police officer in Bangkok. Every 3 months, he would often return to his hometown in Nakhon Pathom. Paul had a total of 5 siblings, being the 3rd child, with one younger brother named Leon living nearby. Leon, a few years younger than Paul, lived just a short distance away from Paul's house, making it convenient for them to meet whenever Paul returned home. On these occasions, Paul would often buy liquor and sit down to drink with Leon. Leon had a close friend named John, whom Paul would sometimes invite to join them. Leon was the youngest son in the family, not very industrious, but had a wife and 3 sons. At Leon's house, his father and grandmother also lived together. One day, when Paul returned home as usual, he bought liquor and went to Leon's house. When he met Leon, Leon smiled at him and said, "This time I'll treat you to the liquor." Paul wondered why Leon suddenly had money, as he usually treated them every time Paul visited. While they were sitting and drinking together, Paul asked Leon straightforwardly what he had been up to and why he could afford to treat them this time. Leon hesitated for a moment and then whispered, "Please don't be mad at me, but recently we've been excavating treasures." Paul, curious, asked what kind of treasures. John answered. He said, "Recently, Leon and I have been fond of searching for treasures in old temples or abandoned places to sell." Upon hearing this, Paul started feeling uneasy and immediately told them to stop and not do it anymore, saying it was not right. Both Leon and John agreed not to pursue it further after Paul's warning. After that day, Paul returned to his work in Bangkok, and 2 months had passed. Paul returned home once more, but this time, Leon had changed. When Paul walked to Leon's house, he saw that a shrine had been set up, and Leon himself had become a shaman. With curiosity, Paul asked the residents what was happening, and they explained that Leon had set up the shrine recently, but they didn't know why he had done so. However, whenever someone sought help or advice, Leon always seemed to provide the right answers, gaining trust and increasing visitors. Paul wanted to see for himself, so he walked up to Leon's house. It was a raised wooden house with stairs leading up to it and 2 large wooden doors at the entrance. Paul noticed many villagers sitting around the house. He ascended the stairs until he reached the front door, where he saw a crowded altar. He attempted to squeeze in but noticed Leon conversing with a villager. Leon's attire was now quite peculiar, resembling that of a traditional Thai dancer, with betel nut stains on his lips as he sat cross-legged, engaging in conversation. Paul noted that Leon's voice sounded normal, but there was a subtle sharpness to it. As Paul looked around, he stumbled upon a statue of a woman dressed in traditional Thai attire, adorned with jewelry and offerings placed at its feet. Turning back to face Leon, Paul couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Yet, he remained seated, observing Leon until the villagers began to leave. In that moment, Leon turned to Paul and pointed his finger, saying, Your money that was borrowed by a friend, you'll get it back soon." Paul was stunned to hear this because he had never disclosed this matter to anyone, not even to his own wife, fearing her reprimand for lending money to his friend. Paul was taken aback by what Leon revealed. Before Leon turned to speak to another villager, time passed continuously until evening, and villagers began to leave until almost none remained. Leon's demeanor now seemed to return to normal, and he got up, changed his clothes, and walked to the front of the house. Seeing Paul waiting, he approached, and the two began to converse as usual, like siblings, out of curiosity. Paul then asked, "What happened? Why did you suddenly become a shaman?" Leon then recounted to Paul that a woman had come into his dreams, claiming to be his guardian angel. She said that her fate aligned with Leon's and that she wanted to help improve his family's well-being because she pitied them. Paul was bewildered by such a story. He couldn't believe something like this could actually happen, but he didn't dwell on it much. The two continued to converse until the next day. Paul returned to work in Bangkok as usual, and time passed until 4 months had gone by. Due to his heavy workload, Paul rarely returned home. Then, one day, he received a telegram informing him of Leon's child's passing. Paul hurried to complete his tasks that day and made his way back for the funeral. The cause of death was a sudden heart attack. After the funeral, Paul returned to work in Bangkok. However, within less than 2 months of his return, another telegram arrived, this time informing him of the passing of Leon's father. Paul attended the funeral once more, where he learned that the cause of death was also a heart attack. Despite these incidents, Paul didn't think much of it, attributing it to coincidence. But as time passed, Paul received another telegram, this time informing him of the passing of Leon's grandmother. Again, the cause of death was a sudden heart attack. Paul began to feel that something was off, but he didn't want to inquire too much, trying to convince himself it was just a series of unfortunate events. By the final round, after Paul had been back at work for less than 4 months, another telegram arrived, informing him of the passing of Leon's middle daughter. The cause of death remained the same, a sudden heart attack. This time, Paul began to feel that something was amiss, but he didn't want to ask Leon too much about it. He tried to think positively, attributing it to coincidence. However, after Paul returned to work for less than 6 months, another telegram arrived, this time informing him of the passing of Leon's eldest daughter. The cause of death was once again a sudden heart attack. At this point, Paul began to find it strange. However, he didn't want to ask Leon too much, trying to think positively. But he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, after less than 4 months of being back at work, another telegram arrived, informing Paul that Leon's mother-in-law had passed away. The cause of death was once again a sudden heart attack. Now, Paul began to feel that something was definitely off, but he didn't want to inquire too much. He tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence. Paul began to think about John, Leon's close friend, intending to ask him. However, when he tried to find John, he couldn't locate him, even though Leon and John were usually inseparable. So Paul went to see Leon's wife instead, to ask about what had been happening. He wanted to know if anything strange had occurred. He wondered why, in just 2 years, 4 members of Leon's family had died, all from heart attacks. Leon's wife explained that ever since Leon had begun practicing shamanism about a month before, he started exhibiting strange behavior. It started with him chasing his wife and children out of the bedroom, insisting on sleeping alone. Every night, she would hear him talking to someone in the room, even though he was alone. Despite the improvement in their financial situation from the success of the shaman's practice, family conflicts intensified. Leon's relationship with his wife and family had never been happy. Leon's wife also mentioned that after this funeral, she intended to take their remaining child and leave this house to go somewhere else. Paul began to ponder why things had turned out this way. He decided to confront Leon that night after the funeral, when things had calmed down. Paul told Leon straightforwardly, "Stop it. Whatever these spiritual practices are, they bring money and gold into the house, but all they bring to the family is conflict. Your parents and grandparents have died, and now 2 of your children. Don't continue this." When Paul finished speaking, Leon became furious and shouted, accusing Paul of jealousy because he had a better status and more money. But Paul tried to reason with him, not wanting to argue. Paul still felt troubled by everything that had happened. The next day, he made the decision to go to a temple. In the temple, there was a venerable monk who was a well-known master, whom Paul greatly respected. Paul recounted the entire incident to the monk, but the monk simply replied that this matter was not within the jurisdiction of the monks, and he couldn't interfere. Upon hearing this, Paul hurried back to Bangkok and resumed his work as usual. However, due to his concern for his friend, Paul traveled to another province to seek out a renowned shaman. Paul tried to recount the entire incident once again to the shaman. After hearing Paul's story, the shaman suggested going to see the site where the shamanic rituals were performed to understand who the spirit that came to possess Leon was. So Paul arranged a day to take the shaman to Leon's house. They met on a day that worked for both of them. Paul drove to pick up the shaman and went straight to Paul's house, which was almost dusk by the time they arrived. Paul then led the shaman to Leon's house. In the meantime, Paul noticed from a distance that Leon was waiting at the staircase leading up to the house, as if he knew Paul was coming. Leon shouted from afar to greet Paul, "Hey bro, what brings you here?" Paul replied, "Just bringing a friend for a visit." After Paul finished speaking, he observed Leon's back and noticed a dark shadow, a large figure, standing behind Leon and embracing him. As Paul approached Leon, the dark shadow became clearer until he could see the figure of a woman wearing Thai clothes, adorned with necklaces and bracelets all over. What was even stranger was that the woman's eyes looked dark red and were gazing directly at Paul. At that moment, Paul was so shocked that he stopped walking and couldn't move properly. Before the shaman beside him could react, he quickly nudged Paul's arm and said, "Let's go home, Captain." Paul began to regain his composure and escorted the shaman back home. The shaman spoke directly to Paul and said, "I'm sorry, Captain, but I can't take on this job." When Paul asked the shaman why he refused to take on the job, the shaman explained that when he walked to Leon's house, he saw a woman wearing Thai clothes standing behind Leon. At first, he thought it was the spirit that possessed Leon, but it seemed more like a half-ghost, half-deity. It possessed much stronger powers than a regular spirit. After that, Paul escorted the shaman back home. The more the shaman spoke in that manner, the more concerned Paul became for his younger brother. So he decided to return to the temple to seek out the monk once again. But before he could say anything upon arrival, the monk interjected, "Can't you just let him go?" As the monk spoke, his gaze shifted past Paul, prompting Paul to quickly turn around in curiosity. However, all he saw was emptiness. Paul turned back to ask the monk who he was talking to, and the monk replied, "You should head up the stupa first." Before Paul could follow the monk up the stupa, the monk warned him that someone was following. He described the appearance of the spirit following them, which closely matched what Paul had seen back at Leon's house. The monk said that the spirit was unhappy that Paul had brought the shaman to chase it away. Despite the monk's attempts to communicate with the spirit, it refused to cooperate. The monk then sneaked into his own chamber and retrieved something. It was a particular amulet. He handed it to Paul, saying, "Keep this amulet with you at all times. Don't let it leave your side." He also warned Paul to be cautious during this time. After that, Paul returned to work as usual. Paul then resumed his usual activities. Less than 2 weeks later, while driving to work, Everything seemed normal until a sedan on the opposite side of the road abruptly swerved, causing a collision with Paul's car. The impact was severe, and Paul was knocked unconscious. After waking up in the hospital, Paul discovered that he had a broken arm but no other serious injuries. Reflecting on the events and the monk's warnings, Paul concluded that the accident was likely caused by the female spirit he encountered earlier. Paul spent about a week recovering in the hospital, contemplating his next move and worrying about his brother. Eventually, he came up with an idea. He thought Leon's close friend, John, might know something. So, Paul asked his friend, who was an investigator, to find out where John was currently located. Eventually, his friend found him. Paul questioned John about why Leon could suddenly become shaman. John seemed hesitant at first, but under Paul's persistence, he reluctantly admitted that one time, he and Leon went to excavate old artifacts at a temple in the other province. There, they found a wooden box inside which was a red cloth-wrapped bundle. Leon unwrapped the cloth, revealing a golden box containing human bones. Leon and John intended to sell the amulet box the next day, but decided to keep it at Leon's house for the night. The next morning, as they were about to leave for the antique shop, Leon changed his mind about selling the box. He then recounted a dream he had the night before, where a woman asked if he wanted a comfortable life with wealth and gold. She proposed a pact. Leon has to let her possess him, and she would help him open a shrine for people to worship. John continued to narrate that after the final funeral of Leon's daughter, why he disappeared. It was because on the night when Leon's daughter was about to pass away, he slept at Leon's house. It was past midnight and he was still awake. He saw a female figure emerging from the statue. Slowly, she walked towards the altar of Leon's daughter, then sat down beside her. Gradually, she reached out her hand towards the daughter's forehead. He saw this and was greatly frightened. He covered himself with a blanket and fell asleep. The next morning, Leon's daughter passed away. With the fear of encountering such things, John avoided going to Leon's house again. When Paul heard about it, he became even more concerned for his younger brother. So, he planned to call 5 police friends to go and arrest the extremists who were deceiving the villagers and extorting money from them. Then, Paul hurriedly drove to the temple to meet the monk again. When Paul met the monk, he quickly bowed. He recounted the events he had heard from John and asked the monk for help once more. It seemed far from ordinary. However, the monk seemed hesitant and reluctant to intervene. Eventually, he relented, acknowledging that humans and spirits were similar in many ways. Just as people eat when they're hungry, spirits may deceive people to fulfill their desires. Some spirits, driven by malicious intent, aspire to become gods. Thus, they rely on human forms to deceive and aid others, hoping for merit and faith. The spirits needed power to strengthen themselves. From being ordinary spirits, they could become deities by inhabiting human bodies. The monk explained that if they truly wanted to help Leon, they needed to find the bones of the spirit and bring them to him. He would then perform a ritual and burn the bones. However, beyond this, the monk's assistance was limited. Paul then asked when would be the best time to retrieve the bones. After some thought, the monk said the best time would be between 3 p.m. and sunset, as the spirit's power would be weaker during that period. With this information, Paul began planning to raid Leon's house the next day. When the day arrived, Paul noticed that Leon's house was crowded with villagers, while Leon himself was secluded inside. Without hesitation, Paul immediately instructed his 4 police friends to apprehend Leon first. Even with the help of 4 policemen, Leon resisted fiercely, almost overpowering them. Meanwhile, Paul and the remaining officers searched Leon's house for the bones. During the chaos, Leon screamed curses at Paul and his friends, causing the nearby villagers flee outside. Despite Paul's efforts to search the area for hours, the bones were nowhere to be found. Paul speculated that they might have been hidden well beyond his reach. While contemplating where Leon might have hidden the bones, he glanced at a statue. Filled with anger, Paul grabbed a large piece of wood and smashed it forcefully against the statue, causing it to crack open. To his surprise, there were golden boxes inside. Without hesitation, Paul instructed his friends to tie up Leon and carried him into the pickup truck. Meanwhile, Leon continued to curse, but Paul paid no attention. They drove straight to the temple where the monk was waiting. The monk quickly performed the necessary rituals and burned the bones along with the golden box. As a result, Leon began to calm down and eventually fell asleep, exhausted from the ordeal. When he woke up, the monk sprinkled holy water on him and explained, "The reason you are like this is because your spirit desires wealth, even to the extent of sacrificing family members for it. The female spirit who was with you used to be restrained by spells, but Leon, you released her. Now, I have performed the ritual to cleanse you." Paul then took Leon back home. By now, Leon looked noticeably thinner and exhausted compared to before. Despite appearing normal earlier, within hours, he had visibly lost weight. Paul settled Leon in for the night, and the next morning, Paul went to check on Leon, only to find him dead. Leon committed suicide by hanging himself. Paul was shocked and couldn't find a reason for Leon's death. Even to this day, he still wonders if it was his involvement that led to his brother's suicide. If he hadn't intervened that day, would his brother still be alive? It's a memory Paul can never forget.